At 3 in the morning, the man who held Seoul in his palm leaned across a scarred wooden counter and did the unthinkable. He didn't demand a drink. He didn't issue a threat. He begged for the truth from a woman who wasn't even supposed to know his name. From behind the safety of the bar, Nyla Monroe watched the monster of the Kang syndicate, her observer, her obsession, unravel in the dim light. And in that silence, she realized the most dangerous thing about her mission wasn't the blood on his hands. It was the fact that she was the only one who could see the man beneath the scars. Nyla Monroe arrived in Korea as a ghost, a woman with a brilliant mind and a desperate need to stay invisible. To the underworld figures who frequented the vault, she was just a waitress in a simple black uniform, a shadow who served whiskey and heard no evil. She spent years perfecting her silence, watching the rise and fall of empires from the edge of the room, waiting for her chance to settle a debt of her own. She expected to remain a spectator. What she didn't expect was Kang Joon-hyuk. Joon-hyuk was a man spiraling toward a betrayal he couldn't see coming, surrounded by enemies who wore the faces of family. He came to the bar looking for a drink, but he stayed for the one person in Seoul who didn't look at him with fear. What neither of them realized was that Nyla wasn't just watching him, she was recording his downfall. Now, as the line between her survival and his ruin begins to vanish, Nyla has to decide. In a world where silence is the only way to stay alive, speaking up for the wrong man isn't just a mistake, it's a death sentence. In the heart of Gangnam's neon-drenched belly, there is a place called the Vault where the air tastes of expensive smoke and secrets. It is a neutral ground, a sanctuary of velvet and shadows where the kings of the underworld come to bleed and brag in equal measure. To work there, you have to be more than a waitress. You have to be a ghost. My name is Nyla Monroe, and I am the best ghost they have. I move through the floor with a rhythmic, practiced invisibility. My natural hair is pulled back into a tight, severe knot, and my black and white uniform is pressed into sharp, clinical lines. In a room full of men who measure power by the volume of their voices and the weight of their gold, I am the silence between their heartbeats. I've learned that in Seoul, being a black woman can make you hypervisible, but in the service of the elite, it makes you a fixture, like the heavy oak bar or the crystal chandeliers. They don't see me because they don't think I'm worth seeing. They assume my Korean is rudimentary at best, and my interest in their business is non-existent. They are wrong on both counts. The glass shield is what I call the barrier I've built around myself. It's the way I keep my eyes lowered just enough to be respectful, but high enough to track the movement of a hand toward a concealed holster. It's the way I keep my hands perfectly still on the tray, even when a glass shatters or a threat is hissed across a table. I am a vault within the vault, collecting the stray pieces of information that fall like crumbs from their feast. A shipment delayed at Incheon, a betrayal brewing in a rival family, a name whispered in fear. The night Kang Joon-hyuk entered, the temperature in the room didn't just drop, it froze. The heavy iron doors swung open, and the usual low hum of the bar died a sudden, violent death. I was polishing a glass at the far end of the counter, my movements steady and rhythmic. I didn't look up, but I felt the shift in the air, a scent of ozone, expensive cedar, and the metallic tang of fresh blood. Joon-hyuk didn't walk like a man. He moved like a predator that had just finished a kill and was looking for a place to lick its wounds. He was in his 30s, his sharp, angular face framed by disheveled black hair that fell over eyes that looked like they had seen the end of the world. His white dress shirt was a disaster. The top 3 buttons were gone. The sleeves were rolled up to reveal thick, dark tattoos that coiled around his forearms like snakes, and a smear of crimson stained his collar. He was the head of the Kang syndicate, a man whose reputation was built on a foundation of ruthlessness, yet tonight he looked dangerously close to a collapse. He didn't head for the VIP booths where his lieutenants waited. Instead, he slumped onto a stool directly in front of me. The power dynamic in the room warped instantly. I could feel the eyes of every bodyguard and soldier on his back, waiting for a command, a spark, or a sign of weakness. I waited the requisite 3 seconds, the exact amount of time an invisible waitress takes to notice a new patron, and then I stepped forward. I didn't offer a smile. I didn't show shock at the blood on his shirt or the wild, unsettled intensity in his gaze. I simply placed a linen coaster on the wood and met his reflection in the mirror behind the bar. "Whiskey," he rasped. His voice was a jagged edge, raw and exhausted. As I reached for the bottle of hibiki, I felt his gaze. Usually men like him look through me. They look at the glass, they look at their own reflection, or they look at the door. But Joon-hyuk was looking at me. His eyes traced the line of my jaw, the stillness of my hands, the absolute lack of tremors in my frame. He was searching for a crack in the glass shield, a flicker of the fear that he used to define his world. I poured the amber liquid, the stream steady and silent. I set the glass down and retreated a single step, resuming my posture of quiet restraint. "You're not shaking," he said. It wasn't a question. He leaned in closer, his heat radiating across the mahogany, his eyes burning with a desperate, frantic curiosity. "Everyone in this city shakes when I look at them tonight. Why aren't you?" I lowered my gaze to the counter, my voice a calm, neutral melody. "The ice is for the glass, Mr. Kang, not the staff." For the first time in my 3 years at the vault, a man didn't just see a waitress. He saw a person. And in the reflection of his dark, haunted eyes, I realized my invisibility had just become my greatest liability. The hunt had begun, and for the first time, the ghost was being haunted. The following night, the iron doors of the vault groaned open at the exact same hour, and the air shifted, signaling his arrival before I even turned around. There was no blood on his collar this time, but the chaos had merely moved inward. Joon-hyuk looked like a man vibrating on a frequency only I could hear. He took the same stool, his presence a dark anchor in the room. I moved toward him without a word, the glass shield firmly in place. My movements were a choreographed dance of indifference. I set the coaster down. I reached for the hibiki. I poured the amber liquid until it hit the exact line of the previous night's pour. I was a machine, a fixture of the bar, as reliable and silent as the clock on the wall. "You didn't look at the door when I walked in," he said, his voice a low vibration that traveled through the mahogany counter and into my fingertips. "I didn't need to, Mr. Kang," I replied, my eyes fixed on the glass. "The room told me you were here." He leaned forward, his shadow stretching over me, blotting out the light from the back bar. "The room goes quiet because they are afraid I will kill them, or they are hoping I will give them a reason to kill me. Which one is it for you, Nyla?" It was the first time he had used my name. He pronounced it with a slow, deliberate care, as if he were testing the weight of it, searching for a reaction. I felt a phantom shiver attempt to climb my spine, but I crushed it. My hands remained flat on the counter, relaxed and open. "Neither," I said softly. "Fear is a luxury for people who have something to lose. And greed, I've seen enough of it in this bar to know it's a thirsty ghost. I have no interest in feeding it." He watched me then, his gaze an intense, unsettling heat. For the next hour, he didn't speak to his lieutenants in the corner booth. He didn't check the encrypted phone that sat vibrating on the bar like a restless insect. He simply watched me work. He watched the way I handled a rowdy businessman with a single, icy stare. He watched the way I memorized complex orders without writing a single word down. Every time I passed him, I could feel his eyes tracking the pulse in my neck, searching for the jump of a nerve or the stutter of a breath. He was a predator trying to understand a creature that refused to run. By the third night, the ritual was established. The first crack in his composure appeared not in his violence, but in his silence. He stopped demanding whiskey and started demanding presence. He would sit in the dim light, his expensive suit jacket discarded, his tie hanging loose, looking less like a king and more like a man drowning in his own crown. "They look at me and see a bank or a bullet," he whispered on the fourth night, staring into his glass as if it were a crystal ball. "My brother looks at me and sees a throne he wants to sit on. My wife looks at me and sees a contract she wants to rewrite. But you," he paused, finally looking up. The unsettled intensity in his eyes had turned into something more dangerous, recognition. "You look at me and see nothing at all. How do you do it?" I paused, a linen cloth draped over my hand. The bar was nearly empty, the low jazz humming in the background like a secret shared between us. I let the silence stretch, a bridge made of everything I wasn't saying. Perhaps it's because I'm not looking at the boss of the Kang syndicate, I said, meeting his gaze for the first time that night. I didn't blink. I didn't look away. I'm looking at a man who hasn't slept in 3 days and is trying to find a truth in a room full of mirrors. Joon-hyuk recoiled slightly as if I had struck him. A jagged, breathless laugh escaped his lips, a sound of genuine shock. The power was shifting. He had come here to test my composure, to find the breaking point of the invisible woman, but instead, he was finding the cracks in his own armor. He reached out, his hand hovering inches from mine on the counter. He didn't touch me, but the air between our skin was electric, thick with the scent of cedar and the mounting pressure of the unspoken. "You're dangerous, Nyla Monroe," he murmured, his voice laced with a newfound respect that felt far more intimate than a threat. "Because you see me, and God help us both, I think I've spent my whole life waiting for someone who wasn't afraid to look." I didn't answer. I simply took his empty glass and moved into the shadows of the back bar, my heart finally betraying me with a single, heavy thud against my ribs. The shield was still there, but for the first time, I could feel the cold air of the world outside beginning to seep through. The following Friday, the air in the vault felt different, heavy, like the stillness before a massive storm breaks over the Han River. It wasn't the usual scent of cedar and whiskey that dominated the room. It was the acrid smell of ambition. I was working the floor, my movements a series of fluid, calculated shadows, when the heavy iron doors opened to admit a man who shared Joon-hyuk's bone structure but none of his soul. This was Dong-gun, the younger brother. Where Joon-hyuk was a jagged blade, exposed and dangerous, Dong-gun was a vial of slow-acting poison. He wore his power like a costume, smiling too widely at the soldiers who bowed to him, his eyes constantly darting around the room to calculate the cost of everything he saw. He didn't sit at the bar. He requested the Bird's Nest, a deep, velvet-lined booth in the furthest corner of the lounge, shielded by a heavy silk curtain and a wall of premium cognac bottles. It was the kind of place where men went when they didn't want to be seen, even by their own kind. "Nyla," the floor manager hissed, catching my arm. "The younger Kang wants service. Only you. He says he heard the ghost is the only one who knows how to keep a glass full without making a sound." I nodded, my expression a mask of professional neutrality, though my heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I prepped a tray with a bottle of aged scotch and 2 glasses. As I approached the booth, I let my footsteps fall into the rhythm of the ambient jazz, making myself part of the background noise. I reached the curtain just as a low, gravelly voice, not Dong-gun's, spoke from the shadows of the booth. "The elders are restless. They don't like the way he's spiraling. He spends more time staring at a waitress than he does at the shipping manifests." I paused. In the world of the vault, a waitress who stops moving is a waitress who gets noticed. I didn't stop. I began to set the tray on the small side table just outside the curtain, my movements slow and agonizingly silent. "He's weak," Dong-gun's voice hissed, sharp as a razor. "He's sentimental. He thinks this bar is a sanctuary, but it's going to be his tomb. He's forgotten that in our family, you don't get to be tired. You only get to be dead." I slid the first glass through the gap in the curtains. My hands were steady, the glass shield holding firm, even as my mind raced to process the vitriol in his tone. I caught a glimpse of him. Dong-gun was leaning forward, his face illuminated by the amber glow of a single candle. Opposite him sat Min-ho, one of Joon-hyuk's senior lieutenants. The betrayal was already deeper than I had imagined. "When?" Min-ho asked. "The weekend," Dong-gun replied, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper that I had to strain to hear. "The merger meeting at the docks is a setup. We'll do a cleanup of the loyalists first. My brother won't even realize the gun is at his head until he's already looking at the harbor floor." "And the girl at the bar." There was a pause. I felt Dong-gun's gaze burn through the silk curtain, landing exactly where I stood. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. I remained a fixture of the furniture. "She's a witness," Dong-gun said indifferently. "Dispose of her with the rest of the trash. I want the vault scrubbed clean by Monday." I finished placing the bottle and retreated into the darkness of the lounge. My face remained calm, my back remained straight, but inside, the ghost was screaming. I had come to Seoul to be invisible, to escape a life of chaos, only to find myself standing in the center of a kill zone. As I looked across the room and saw Joon-hyuk entering, his eyes immediately seeking mine out with that same desperate, haunting recognition, I realized that my silence was no longer my protection. It was a ticking clock. If I stayed a ghost, we would both be dead by Sunday. For the first time in my life, I didn't just need to see, I needed to act. The following night, the air in the vault was thick with a deceptive sense of ceremony. Joon-hyuk was hosting a reconciliation dinner in the private dragonglass room, a soundproof sanctuary where the syndicate's top brass gathered to toast to a stability that didn't exist. I was the lead server, moving with the rhythmic grace of a ghost, though my skin felt like it was crawling with the weight of the secret I carried. I had spent the morning in my small apartment, prying open a floorboard to retrieve a kit I hadn't touched since leaving the States. I wasn't just a waitress who spoke Korean. I was the daughter of a woman who had taught me that in the world of men, a girl's only true friends are her eyes and her chemistry. I had identified the cleanup poison from the whispers I'd intercepted, a slow-acting neurotoxin that mimicked a heart attack, favored by Donggun for its surgical cleanliness. As I entered the dragonglass room, the tension was a physical wall. Joon-hyuk sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of weary authority. Donggun sat to his right, wearing a smile that looked like a scar. "A toast," Donggun announced, his voice smooth and oily. "To the longevity of the Kang name and the wisdom of my brother." He signaled to the wine steward, a man I knew had been drinking with Minho until dawn. I watched with narrowed eyes as the steward poured a vintage Cabernet. There was a subtle tremor in his hand, a fractional pause as he reached Joon-hyuk's glass. My glass shield remained intact, but my mind was a storm of calculations. I saw the faint, oily sheen on the surface of the wine as it caught the light of the chandelier. I moved before I could talk myself out of it. I tripped. It was a perfect, practiced stumble, clumsy enough to be believable, yet controlled enough to be precise. As I brushed past the steward to steady myself, my hand moved with the speed of a card shark. I didn't knock the glass over. Instead, I used the distraction of my falling tray to drop a single, concentrated charcoal-based neutralizing agent into Joon-hyuk's drink. It was a tasteless, odorless compound designed to bind with toxins before they could enter the bloodstream. "Watch yourself, girl," Donggun snapped, his eyes flashing with irritation at the interruption. "Forgive me, Mr. Kang," I murmured, my voice a soft, trembling melody of feigned terror. I lowered my head, the image of the perfect, frightened servant. "I am clumsy tonight. The floor is slick." Joon-hyuk's eyes were on me. He didn't look angry. He looked puzzled. He had seen me move with the precision of a surgeon for months. He knew I didn't trip. He watched me as I gathered the fallen napkins, his dark eyes searching mine for the truth I couldn't speak. "It's fine," Joon-hyuk said, his voice cutting through his brother's venom. He picked up the glass. My breath hitched in my throat. I had calculated the dosage, but there was no room for error. If the poison was too fast or my antidote too slow, he would be dead before the second course. Donggun watched his brother with the rapt attention of a vulture. Joon-hyuk took a long, deliberate drink. The room went silent. I retreated to the shadows by the sideboard, my hands clasped tightly behind my back to hide the fact that I was finally, for the first time, shaking. 10 seconds passed. 20. Donggun's smile began to falter, turning into a confused frown as his brother didn't clutch his chest. Instead, Joon-hyuk set the glass down with a heavy thud, the color returning to his face as the neutralizer did its work. "Excellent vintage," Joon-hyuk remarked, his voice stronger than it had been all night. He turned his head and looked directly at me in the shadows. He knew. He didn't know how, and he didn't know what, but he knew the clumsy waitress had just stood between him and the grave. The shield was broken. I had stepped out of the background and into the line of fire. As the dinner continued, Joon-hyuk's gaze never left me for long. The recognition in his eyes had evolved into something more terrifying, a silent, burning vow. I had saved the monster, and in doing so, I had made myself part of his war. The heavy iron doors of the vault had been bolted for the night, leaving the bar in a state of hollow silence, illuminated only by the ghostly blue glow of the liquor shelves. I was wiping down the mahogany counter, my movements mechanical, my mind still replaying the narrow escape of the dinner party. I thought I was alone until the scent of cedar and smoke filled the air, and a shadow fell across my hands. Joon-hyuk was standing at the end of the bar. He had stripped off his suit jacket and his waistcoat. His white shirt was unbuttoned halfway down his chest, the sleeves rolled up past his elbows to reveal the ink that claimed his skin. He didn't look like a boss. He looked like a man who had been hollowed out. "The wine was poisoned," he said. His voice wasn't a threat. It was a low, jagged confession. He stepped into the light, and I saw the tremor in his fingers as he reached for a glass. My brother's ambition finally outweighed his patience. He wanted me to die at that table. I kept my head down, my cloth moving in steady circles. "I wouldn't know anything about that, Mr. Kang. I'm just the help." "Stop it," he rasped, moving with a sudden, desperate speed to catch my wrist. His grip wasn't painful, but it was absolute. "No more ghost, Nyla, not tonight. I saw your hand move. I felt the change in the glass. You didn't just trip, you stood between me and a casket." He let go of my wrist and did something I never expected. He turned away from me and pulled his shirt off his shoulders, letting it drape around his waist. In the dim light, his back was a map of tragedy. Beneath the intricate black ink of the dragons and the swirling storms were the scars, jagged white lines from blades, round puckered marks from cigarettes, and the deep, angry welts of old betrayals. "This is the price of the throne," he whispered, looking at me over his shoulder. His eyes were raw, stripped of the arrogance he wore like armor. "Every inch of me is marked by someone I trusted, my father, my captains, and now my blood brother." He stepped closer, his chest heaving. "I am surrounded by people who want to consume me. And then there's you, a woman who should be terrified, yet you move like you've walked through fire before." He leaned his forehead against the cool wood of the bar, his vulnerability so thick it felt like a physical weight in the room. "Why save me? I'm a monster by trade. You could have let the poison take me and walked away clean." I reached out, my fingers hovering just an inch above the scarred skin of his shoulder. The glass shield didn't just crack, it shattered. "Because," I said, my voice barely audible in the vast silence of the bar, "even monsters deserve to choose how they fall. And you aren't ready to fall yet, Joon-hyuk." He looked up, and for the first time, the power didn't shift, it fused. We were no longer boss and waitress. We were two survivors standing in the ruins of a burning world, realizing that the only thing more dangerous than the enemies at the door was the truth between us. The weekend arrived with a silence so absolute it felt like a physical weight pressing against the windows of the vault. Outside, the Seoul skyline was obscured by a thick, freezing rain that turned the neon lights into smeared stains of red and blue. Inside, the bar was officially closed, but the air was charged with the electricity of an impending execution. Joon-hyuk sat at the center of the bar, his hand resting near a heavy black handgun, his eyes fixed on the security monitors. He had tried to send me away an hour ago, but the ghost had finally refused to vanish. I was behind the counter, my fingers tracing the hidden edge of a laptop I had stashed beneath the liquor crates. The first explosion wasn't a sound, but a vibration that shattered the expensive crystal on the back shelves. Then came the screech of tires and the rhythmic thud of heavy boots on the pavement outside. "They're here," Joon-hyuk said, his voice eerily calm. The front doors didn't just open, they were breached. A swarm of men in tactical gear, led by Dong-gun's personal guard, flooded the entryway. Joon-hyuk moved with a terrifying, fluid grace, overturning a heavy oak table to create a barricade. The room erupted into a deafening chaos of gunfire and shattering glass. I dived behind the reinforced mahogany of the bar, the scent of gunpowder stinging my nostrils. Joon-hyuk fought like a man who had already accepted his death. He fired with surgical precision, holding the line as the circle of light around the bar grew smaller and smaller. But the numbers were against him. A stray bullet grazed his shoulder, spinning him around, and another caught him in the thigh. He slumped against the brass footrail, his breathing ragged and wet. "Joon-hyuk!" I crawled toward him, ignoring the splinters of wood biting into my knees. He looked at me, his face pale, his eyes searching for mine through the smoke. He pulled the trigger of his weapon. A hollow click echoed through the room. Out of ammo. The gunfire ceased, replaced by the slow, arrogant click of dress shoes on the marble floor. Dong-gun stepped through the debris, flanked by a dozen armed men. He looked down at his brother with a chilling, triumphant smile, the barrel of his pistol leveled at Joon-hyuk's forehead. "You always were too sentimental for this life, brother," Dong-gun sneered, his thumb pulling back the hammer. "You died the moment you let a waitress into your head." The shooters tightened their circle, their muzzles trained on us. Joon-hyuk reached out, his bloody hand finding mine beneath the counter. He squeezed my fingers, a final, silent apology. He thought it was over. He thought the trap had closed. But he had forgotten one thing: a ghost doesn't just watch, a ghost learns. I didn't look at the guns. I looked at the digital clock on the wall, waiting for the final second to tick over. My hand moved to the laptop, my finger hovering over the enter key. The trap wasn't just for Joon-hyuk. It was for everyone in the room. The air in the room didn't just grow cold. It became clinical. I didn't flinch at the dozen gun barrels leveled at my chest. Instead, I stood up slowly, shedding the hunched, submissive posture of a waitress like a second skin. My eyes, once perpetually lowered, snapped up to meet Dong-gun, with a clarity that made him hesitate. "You're right about one thing, Dong-gun," I said, my voice cutting through the ringing silence of the gunfight. I didn't speak the hesitant, broken Korean of a foreigner anymore. My accent was flawless, the cold, sharp dialect of the Seoul elite. "Your brother was too sentimental. He saw a woman in need of a job, but you're just a fool who saw a background character." I reached under the bar and pulled the laptop onto the blood-stained mahogany. The screen glowed, casting a stark blue light across my face. "What is this?" Dong-gun hissed, his pistol twitching. "Kill her." "Touch a trigger and the Kang syndicate ceases to exist in approximately 5 seconds, I stated. My fingers danced across the keys with a terrifying, rhythmic speed. "I didn't come to Seoul for tips, Dong-gun. I came for the ledger. You think you're conducting a cleanup? I've been conducting an audit." I turned the screen toward the room. It wasn't just a list of names. It was a live stream of the syndicate's offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Luxembourg, and Panama. As they watched, the numbers began to scroll backward, millions of dollars vanishing into the digital ether every second. "That's the Ghost Protocol," I said, my voice dropping to a low, lethal hum. "I've spent the last year mapping your brother's infrastructure. I have the keys to your shell companies, your shipping manifests, and the encrypted evidence of every bribe you've paid to the Blue House. Right now, your entire fortune is being rerouted to a blind trust that only I can access." The gunmen shifted, their eyes darting from Dong-gun to the screen. Loyalty in the underworld is a currency, and I was devaluing it in real time. "Who are you?" Joon-hyuk gasped from the floor, his eyes wide with a mix of agony and awe. I didn't look at him. Not yet. I kept my gaze locked on the man holding the gun. "I'm the person you've been talking over for 3 years. I'm the one who knows exactly how much your soul is worth, Dong-gun. And according to my screen, you're currently bankrupt." The power in the room didn't just shift, it inverted. The soldiers didn't see a waitress anymore. They saw the only person who could pay them or ruin them. The invisible woman had just become the most powerful person in the city. The silence that followed my revelation was heavier than the gunfire had been. Dong-gun stood frozen, his finger trembling on the trigger, his eyes fixed on the numbers hemorrhaging from his life's work. The gunmen behind him lowered their sights, the cold math of survival overriding their orders. They weren't looking at a waitress anymore. They were looking at the person who held their pensions, their family's safety, and their future in a folder on a screen. "You're lying," Dong-gun hissed, though the sweat beading on his forehead betrayed him. "You're a ghost. You're nothing." "I'm the person who has been listening while you thought I was invisible," I said, my voice as steady as the rhythmic hum of the servers in the back. I tapped a final key, and a high-pitched alert echoed from the tactical tablets the men carried. "Check your encrypted accounts. I just sent a $1 deposit to every man in this room. Consider it a down payment on your common sense." One by one, the soldiers reached for their devices. I watched the realization dawn on their faces. I hadn't just breached the syndicate, I had identified every single one of them. The moment my heart rate exceeds a certain threshold, or this laptop loses its connection to the secure server, the ghost protocol executes its final phase, I continued, leaning over the counter, my gaze pinning Dong-gun to the spot. The funds won't just vanish, they'll be flagged by Interpol and the National Tax Service. By dawn, every man in this room will be the target of a global manhunt with zero resources to hide. Is your loyalty to a dead man's brother worth a lifetime in a black site prison? Dong-gun screamed, a sound of pure, unadulterated rage, and lunged forward. But he didn't even reach the bar. The men who had been his shadows only seconds ago stepped in his path, the barrels of their rifles now pressed against his own ribs. The mutiny had been decapitated by a keystroke. "Step back, Dong-gun," Minho said, his voice cold. He looked at me, a flicker of genuine fear behind his eyes. "What do you want, Nyla?" "I want the doors locked. I want the wounded treated. And I want you to realize that from this moment on, the Kang Syndicate doesn't run on blood," I said, looking down at Joon-hyuk, who was watching me with a mixture of agony and a strange, terrifying pride. "It runs on me." I closed the laptop halfway, the blue glow still illuminating the room like a warning light. I had saved the man, but I had destroyed the world he knew. I was no longer the ghost in the machine. I was the machine itself. And as I reached out to take Joon-hyuk's blood-stained hand, I knew the price of our survival was a silence that would never be truly quiet again. The storm that had nearly leveled the vault eventually broke, leaving Seoul washed in a fragile, early morning light. In the aftermath, the blood was scrubbed from the marble, and the glass was replaced, but the foundation of the Kang Syndicate had been permanently altered. Dong-gun was gone, relegated to the shadows of a prison cell by the very data I had leveraged, and the men who had once looked through me now bowed their heads when I walked through the halls. I stood on the expansive glass balcony of the Kang penthouse, the city sprawling beneath us like a map of glowing circuits. The wind pulled at my hair, no longer pinned into a severe, invisible knot, but flowing free. I wasn't wearing the black-and-white uniform of a servant. I wore a suit of deep charcoal silk, sharp enough to cut, a reflection of the power I now wielded openly. Joon-hyuk stepped out from the floor-to-ceiling doors, his movements slower than before, a cane clicking softly against the stone, a reminder of the night the trap had sprung. He didn't stop at the doorway. He walked until he was standing directly beside me, his shoulder brushing mine. "The board met this morning," he said, his voice no longer jagged with desperation, but grounded in a new, quiet strength. "They accepted the new terms. The offshore accounts remain under your encryption. They know that to move against me is to trigger the ghost protocol." "And what about you, Joon-hyuk?" I asked, looking out at the Han River. "Are you comfortable being a king who doesn't hold the keys to his own treasury?" He turned to me, and the light of the rising sun caught the scars on his neck, the marks he no longer tried to hide beneath a buttoned-up collar. He reached out, his hand finding mine on the railing. His grip was firm, an anchor in the high-altitude wind. "I spent my life holding keys that only opened doors to empty rooms," he murmured. "I'd rather be a partner to a woman who sees me than a ruler of a world that only fears me." The power dynamic had shifted for the last time. We weren't a boss and a waitress, nor a target and a hunter. We were two architects of a new regime, built on the ruins of silence and the strength of a truth that had nearly killed us both. "We're never going to be safe," I noted, the strategist in me already calculating the next move, the next threat. Joon-hyuk pulled me closer, his eyes reflecting the same fierce recognition that had started it all in a dim bar at 3 a.m. "Safety is for people who don't have anything worth fighting for. I'll take the danger, Nyla, as long as I take it with you." Beside him, I watched the city wake up. The ghost had finally stopped running, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't just watching the world, I was helping him lead it.